As we've discussed in recent weeks, the matter of grid decarbonisation is becoming of increasing political importance as the two main political parties take different positions on the matter. Under the Labour Party's plans, it proposes entirely to decarbonise the grid by 2030, in just 6 years' time. In practice, this means drastically reducing our reliance on gas power and other sources of non-renewable energy. But how this is achievable is unclear because the grid currently operates with gas power stations used as a backup when the wind isn't blowing and when the sun isn't shining. If the grid were to be decarbonised by 2030, what will we do in these frequent instances when the sun and wind cannot be relied upon? The Conservative plan isn't much better, as it proposes decarbonisation by 2035. Although this gives a little more time for the development of carbon capture and energy storage technology, the questions for the Labour's plan apply very much to the Conservative plan too. That's why I believe we should abandon the policy and indefinitely postpone net zero. But Policy Exchange's new report has cast even more doubt on the overall structure. The report has estimated that the Conservative plan for 2035 would cost about £105 billion, which is clearly unaffordable while the cost of living is high, as well as the tax burden at almost record levels. But more importantly, the Labour plan is estimated to cost an additional £116 billion of your money over the next 11 years, about £15 billion a year more. And what is even more damning than this is that the report has said that even if Labour could acquire the additional funds, which would be from you by taxing you even more, the project is unfeasible owing to supply chain constraints, lead times and skills shortages. So, when the shadow climate change secretary and famous bacon sandwich eater Ed Miliband doubled down on the plan earlier this month, he was ignoring reality. This news has coincided with the fact that Ofcom has announced plans to remove the current electricity price cap system and replace it with a variable cap. Ofgem, of course, not Ofcom. In other words, everything you've been told about smart meters is not true, even when they work, which apparently 4 million of them do not. While you were led to believe that they were there to help you manage your money, in reality they are being introduced to implement a surge pricing system to cost you more. So instead of the grid doing what it ought to do, providing greater supply when demand increases, instead it will push prices up to reduce demand. And why will it do this? Because when the grid is decarbonised, we will not be able to meet peak demand because we'll be relying on solar and wind, which are unreliable. UK's energy infrastructure is being engulfed by the net zero utopia, but the role of the government is to make people's lives easier and more affordable. And only when we break free from this fantasy world will we be able to provide cheap energy as the United States, India and China do. As ever, let me know your thoughts, mailmog@gbnews.com. Well, I'm very pleased now to be joined by Bob Ward, Policy and Communications Director of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics. Thank you very much for coming in.
Hello.
These plans just aren't realistic, are they? There isn't £116 billion around at the moment. And if there were, we should be spending it on defence when we've got a threat from Russia and China and Iran.
Well, these numbers are investments, mostly paid for by the private sector, that will generate jobs and growth. And we have a great problem with a lack of investment in this country. But let's remember why we're doing it. These investments will reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. And fossil fuels are costing us huge amounts. The energy price guarantee and the other policies that you introduced as Energy Minister to protect consumers rightly against the surging price in natural gas cost the British taxpayer £78 billion. £78 billion of British taxpayer subsidy that went directly into the pockets of energy companies. You poured half back through the windfall tax.
But that was a self-inflicted cost because we haven't had fracking to get cheap gas out of the ground in the UK. We decided that we would have this mad environmentalist policy that means we weren't maximising our fossil fuel resources and we therefore allowed ourselves to become dependent on Russia. That was an entirely predictable series of policy mistakes made because of the green obsession.
Well, maximising the oil and gas from the North Sea is actually in law, so it is part of government policy.
Which is not fracking. Fracking is a great opportunity. And we get fracked gas from the United States instead of doing it ourselves, which would be much cheaper and more environmentally friendly.
I mean, fracking around the country, people have made their views known. But the important thing is that any oil and gas that we produce in the UK, either in the North Sea or online, is sold on international markets. The oil and gas that we were buying during the cost of living crisis included British gas.
But as you know,
it doesn't reduce our bills.
Of course it does. Because pricing is set at the margin. So if supply is increased, even when demand increases, that supply means that the overall price is lower. That's just the basics of supply and demand.
No, I'm sorry, Jacob, you misunderstand. The impact of the war, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, drastically reduced the amount of gas. There's nowhere near enough gas in the UK to restore those levels of supply.
International prices are set by total supply and total demand. If we increase our supply, that has effect on international prices. Therefore, the price is lower for everybody.
We have a minuscule amount of gas. It makes no difference.
Of course it makes a difference. This is a simple misunderstanding. A simple misunderstanding of economics, particularly with gas, which either has to be transported or burnt off.
So why didn't we reduce the price of gas during the cost of living crisis, Jacob?
The price of gas came down as supply came on.
No, it didn't.
Online.
The price went up. You had to protect consumers by spending £78 billion
extra supply came on. Extra supply came on from Texas. It came on from Qatar. Increased supply saw the price come down.
Yeah, but they have lots of gas, Jacob. We don't have anywhere near that amount of gas.
We do if we fracked it.
No, we really don't.
But the fundamental point you're missing, and all the people who've made this argument are missing, is that all pricing is set at the margin. So if you
understand how it works, Jacob.
If you have a cubic foot extra of gas, the price comes down. If you have a cubic foot too little, the price goes up. Therefore, marginal supply is crucially important to any pricing mechanism.
It is. However, if you reduce supply by 38 billion tonnes and you replace it with 300 million tonnes, you do not restore the level of pricing.
Yes, but if we had been fracking, we would have had a much higher base to start with.
We really don't have that much.
And
if you could persuade your constituents that you're happy to have them have it fracked in their back garden,
they would
it won't make any difference. There's no economist who will tell you that we have enough to reduce the global price of gas.
It has made an enormous difference in the United States, where their fracking has both reduced their emissions and reduced their cost of energy.
Okay. Tell me how much you think the global price of gas has been reduced by British gas over the past 2 years. At a time when we've had to subsidise British consumers have been subsidised by £78 billion.
And market forces have worked because places like the US and Qatar have brought on masses of new supply.
We are still...
So prices have come down.
Indeed.
The point is...
You increase supply by big producers. We're not a big producer.
Where are we getting this £116 billion
OK, so let's talk about investment. So remember, this is an investment...
Investment is a new Labour word for spending. This is money that will be spent.
Investment is something that
what return will people get? It's a dishonest word. It's a dishonest word. Because investment is when you put money in the bank and get interest on it. It's not when you spend money you don't get back.
Let me give you an example of an investment. Investment could be something like spending money on replacing gas boilers with heat pumps to heat. Hold on, let me explain that. No. It's an investment because the return is you do not then pay eye-watering prices for natural gas.
Natural gas prices come right down.
That's an investment because you save money.
You're spending £13,000. You're spending £13,000 rather than £3,000.
You save the British taxpayer £78 billion that you spend on price guarantees.
I wouldn't appoint you as my investment manager because I'd go bankrupt within weeks. If you think spending £10,000 extra is an investment...
Jacob, you spent the £78 billion that went into the pocket of energy producers.
That was because we had this absurd obsession with green energy when we've got plenty.
It wasn't. It went to the oil and gas companies, Jacob.
If we hadn't closed down our coal-powered electricity stations, we would have had that resource for energy, we would have had our own gas resources from fracking, and it's the green obsession that has put prices up.
So you want to go back to the 1950s when we were...
my constituents...
want coal. I'm pretty sure your constituents don't want climate change and they don't want air pollution.
I don't want them to be cold and poor, and we make no difference. 1% of global emissions.
That's how much you spend.
Thank you very much, Bob, because we've got to end.